Just in. A private demand made by Donald Trump for critical heavy machinery has triggered a political and economic standoff that is now spreading across trade, manufacturing, and diplomatic channels. According to multiple sources familiar with the discussions, this was not a routine negotiation. It was not a request buried in technical paperwork. It was a direct push for accelerated access to industrial equipment that underpins some of the largest construction, infrastructure, and energy projects in North America. And the response was not a delay, not a counteroffer, not a diplomatic statement. It was one word: no. That single word is now echoing across markets in ways few people expected. Tonight, we begin breaking down what Trump demanded, who said no, and why this moment matters far more than it appears on the surface. Because once you understand the machinery behind this dispute, it becomes clear that this was never really about machines. It was about leverage. It was about control of supply chains. And it was about how fragile economic diplomacy has become in 2026. According to reporting from Reuters, Bloomberg, and the Financial Times, the demand emerged during late-stage discussions tied to infrastructure, trade logistics, and industrial supply chains. Trump reportedly pushed for priority access to heavy machinery assets worth tens of billions of dollars, equipment critical for large-scale construction, extraction, and transport projects. These are not generic products. We are talking about ultra-heavy excavators, turbine transport systems, mining platforms, and specialized industrial vehicles that often take 12 to 24 months to build and depend on hundreds of upstream components. Most of this equipment is produced in Canada, Germany, and East Asia and is already locked into long-term supply contracts. The demand was simple in structure but explosive in consequence. Accelerate delivery schedules, override existing export priorities, move the United States to the front of the line. The timeline was not years, it was months. From a political perspective, the logic was obvious. The United States is facing growing bottlenecks in infrastructure, energy, and manufacturing. Delays are piling up, costs are exploding, and Trump wanted to force the system to bend. But systems built on contracts, capacity limits, and physical constraints do not bend easily. On the other side of that demand sat policymakers who saw immediate red flags. And the answer that came back, reportedly from a key partner whose manufacturing sector supplies roughly 22% of U.S. heavy industrial imports, was simply no. That partner, according to multiple sources, was Canada. To understand why this refusal landed like a shockwave, you have to look at the context in which it happened. This standoff is unfolding at the same time as a severe aluminum supply crisis in the United States. Since June 2025, U.S. aluminum prices have surged more than 40%, breaking records above $5,200 per metric ton. Inventories have collapsed from around 750,000 tons at the start of 2025 to under 300,000 tons today. That is a drop of roughly 60% in 12 months. Construction firms across the country are reporting delays, cost overruns, and project suspensions. The Midwest aluminum premium has hit 96 cents per pound, up 65% in less than a year. Canada sits at the center of this storm. Canadian suppliers provide about 70% of nearly 4 million tons of U.S. aluminum imports. But under Trump's 50% tariff regime, shipping to the United States has become economically irrational. Canadian producers have been redirecting shipments to Europe and other markets where they can actually make money. The result is a supply squeeze inside the United States that is already hurting construction, automotive manufacturing, aerospace, and energy infrastructure. This is the environment in which Trump made his machinery demand. From the White House perspective, the pressure is obvious. Projects are slipping, political timelines are tightening, delays translate into bad headlines. But from Ottawa's perspective, the picture looks very different. Canada is dealing with labor shortages, energy costs that are more than 30% higher than in 2022, and massive existing commitments tied to climate transition infrastructure. More importantly, Canadian officials understand something crucial. At this exact moment, Canada holds leverage. This leverage did not come from clever diplomacy. It came from structure. When Trump doubled aluminum tariffs in 2025, the goal was to force investment back into the United States and reduce import dependence. But heavy industry does not work on political timelines. You cannot build new smelters, new factories, and new machinery supply chains overnight. Those projects take years and billions in capital. In the meantime, American industry still needs inputs today. So the tariffs created a paradox. They were supposed to create leverage. Instead, they created dependence under worse conditions. This is why the machinery demand mattered so much. It was not just about equipment. It was an attempt to use political pressure to override physical and contractual reality. Analysts describe it as a stress test of economic power, a test of whether the United States could still force priority access simply by demanding it. Canada's answer suggests that the balance has shifted. Prime Minister Mark Carney, a former central banker who understands leverage better than most politicians, appears to have calculated that giving in now would mean surrendering Canada's strongest negotiating position just months before the critical USMCA review, scheduled for July 2026. From a game theory perspective, the logic is brutal. If Canada relieves the pressure on American industries by saying yes, it removes the incentive for Washington to compromise. If Canada holds firm, the pain inside the US system intensifies, and that pain becomes political. Markets understood this immediately. Shares of several US infrastructure and equipment-dependent firms dropped within days. Logistics insurers adjusted risk premiums. Analysts began modeling escalation scenarios. And suddenly, what looked like a narrow dispute over machinery began to look like the opening phase of a much larger trade confrontation. And this is only the beginning. The moment Canada said no, the consequences began moving faster than most policymakers expected. This was not a symbolic disagreement. It was a stress fracture in the physical economy. Within days, trade analysts started revising risk models, logistics insurers adjusted coverage terms, and procurement departments across American industry began quietly preparing for longer delays and higher costs. The reason was simple. This dispute had exposed something many executives already feared but rarely said out loud. North American supply chains were no longer resilient. They were political. To understand why the shock spread so quickly, you have to look at how modern industrial systems actually function. Heavy machinery is not a stock market asset. You cannot substitute it with paperwork. A single ultra-heavy excavator, turbine transporter, or mining platform can cost several $1,000,000 and requires 12 to 24 months of coordinated production. Each unit depends on hundreds of specialized parts sourced from dozens of suppliers across multiple countries. When one link is disrupted, the entire chain slows down. According to OECD data, more than 68% of specialized industrial machinery used in major US infrastructure and energy projects is imported. That dependency has always existed, but it was tolerated because trade relationships were predictable, contracts were respected, delivery schedules were boring. In 2026, none of that is true anymore. The aluminum crisis had already weakened the system. Since mid-2025, American aluminum inventories have been collapsing as Canadian producers redirect shipments to markets that are not penalized by tariffs. Construction firms are paying record premiums. Automotive manufacturers are seeing margins shrink. Aerospace suppliers are warning of delivery delays. Into this already strained environment came the machinery standoff. For American companies, the immediate problem is planning. You cannot build a pipeline, a factory, or a power facility if you do not know when your core equipment will arrive. One delayed shipment can idle hundreds of workers. One missed window can trigger penalties, contract disputes, and cascading rescheduling across entire project portfolios. In Michigan and Pennsylvania, manufacturers dependent on specialized equipment have already begun adjusting production timelines. In Texas, energy infrastructure contractors are warning that delays could add tens of % to total project costs. These are not hypothetical numbers. They are being written into revised budgets right now. Small and mid-sized firms are the most vulnerable. A major corporation can sometimes absorb a 6-month delay or renegotiate financing. A regional construction firm working on fixed-price contracts cannot. If machinery arrives late and material costs have risen 40% in the meantime, the margin disappears. In some cases, the company disappears with it. Bankruptcies in the construction supply chain are already ticking higher, quietly, away from headlines. The automotive sector is especially exposed. Modern vehicles, particularly electric vehicles, rely heavily on aluminum and specialized components. Ford, General Motors, and several major suppliers have acknowledged in filings that material cost volatility and supply uncertainty are now core risks. Higher input costs either mean higher prices for consumers or lower production volumes. Neither option is politically comfortable. What makes this standoff different from past trade disputes is that it is not centered on tariffs alone. It is about physical bottlenecks. You can raise or lower a tariff with a signature. You cannot create a new heavy machinery factory or aluminum smelter in 6 months. Capacity is destiny in this environment. Canada understands this, and Canada is acting accordingly. Prime Minister Mark Carney's government has been unusually direct in its messaging. Officials have emphasized contract integrity and production constraints. But behind that language is a strategic calculation. Canada knows that American industries are under pressure created largely by American policy. The 50% aluminum tariff did not create domestic capacity. It created shortages. Those shortages are now colliding with machinery delays to form a broader industrial slowdown. From a negotiation standpoint, this is leverage in its purest form. The side that controls scarce inputs controls the timeline. This is also why Canada has been accelerating its diplomatic diversification. In January 2026, Carney traveled to Beijing to reopen and expand trade channels. European partners are being courted more aggressively. The message is subtle but clear. Canada is no longer willing to treat the United States as its only strategic outlet. If access to the American market comes with political unpredictability, Canadian industry will find other buyers. That shift has long-term consequences. Once supply chains reorient, they rarely snap back to their old shape. The United States learned this during the semiconductor shortage earlier in the decade. Companies that rebuilt sourcing networks in Asia and Europe did not automatically return when conditions normalized. Trust, once broken, is expensive to rebuild. Markets are starting to price this in. Shares of infrastructure-dependent firms have been volatile. Equipment dealers are warning investors about order uncertainty. Logistics companies are charging higher premiums for projects with cross-border dependencies. Even insurers are rewriting risk models to account for political interference in supply chains. Inside Washington, the political tension is rising. Some Republican lawmakers aligned with business interests are openly warning that the tariff strategy is backfiring. They are hearing directly from manufacturers, builders, and energy companies that the pain is real and growing. Democrats are using the crisis as evidence of policy failure and are calling for hearings on the aluminum shortage and equipment bottlenecks. In Ottawa, the political dynamic is the opposite. Carney's firm stance has boosted his approval ratings. Even traditionally pro-US constituencies are supporting a tougher line, arguing that Canada cannot allow its economy to be used as a pressure valve for American policy mistakes. This is how trade conflicts evolve into something more dangerous, not through dramatic announcements, but through slow erosion of predictability. And the most important question now is not who wins this particular standoff. It is what happens if this logic becomes permanent. If every supply chain becomes a political weapon, investment slows, costs rise, and planning horizons shrink. That is how you get structural stagnation, not just a bad quarter. In the next part, we will look at how this conflict is already spilling into financial markets, legal frameworks, and the USMCA negotiations, and why July 2026 is becoming the real deadline that everyone in both governments is quietly watching. As the machinery standoff drags on, the conflict is no longer confined to factory floors and construction sites. It is now spreading into financial markets, legal frameworks, and the political architecture that governs North American trade. What began as a dispute over equipment access is evolving into a systemic stress test of the entire US-Canada economic relationship. Markets were the first to react. In the days following the refusal, shares of several infrastructure, construction, and heavy equipment-dependent companies swung sharply. Investors are not just pricing in delays, they are pricing in uncertainty. When capital expenditure plans depend on cross-border supply chains that can be disrupted by a single political decision, the risk profile of entire sectors changes. Analysts at multiple investment banks have begun warning clients that 2026 could see a wave of postponed or canceled projects, not because demand has collapsed, but because inputs have become unreliable. Insurance markets are adjusting as well. Large-scale infrastructure projects rely heavily on insurance coverage for delivery risk, delay penalties, and force majeure events. Insurers are now rewriting clauses and raising premiums for projects that depend on Canadian machinery or aluminum inputs. Some underwriters are reportedly demanding political risk riders for what used to be routine industrial contracts. That is a quiet but powerful signal. It means the system is beginning to treat North American trade as a geopolitical risk zone rather than a stable internal market. The legal dimension is just as dangerous. Many of the machinery and materials involved are governed by long-term contracts with strict delivery schedules and penalty clauses. If governments attempt to override these agreements for political reasons, they open the door to arbitration, lawsuits, and years of legal battles. Trade lawyers point out that the USMCA framework includes dispute resolution mechanisms, but those processes are slow. Cases can take years. Businesses do not have years. They have payrolls to meet and projects to deliver. Inside Washington, some advisors are reportedly floating the idea of invoking national security provisions to compel cooperation. On paper, that authority exists. In practice, it would be an earthquake. Using national security justifications to override contracts and trade commitments would almost certainly trigger immediate retaliation from Canada and potentially from other partners as well. It would also tell every supplier in the world that political risk in the United States has become structural. Ottawa is watching this closely. Canadian officials have been careful in public statements, but privately they are preparing legal and diplomatic responses to any such move. The calculation in Ottawa is that if the United States escalates in this way, the relationship enters a fundamentally different phase. At that point, the dispute is no longer about tariffs or machinery. It is about trust in the entire trade framework. And that brings us to the real battlefield. The USMCA review, scheduled for July 2026. That review was always going to be tense. Trump has repeatedly signaled that he sees the agreement not as a stable framework, but as a tool for constant renegotiation. Canada and Mexico see it differently. For them, predictability is the point. The current crisis is now bleeding directly into those talks. From Canada's perspective, the logic is straightforward. If Washington is willing to weaponize access to markets and supply chains whenever it faces domestic pressure, then any agreement on paper is only as good as the next political crisis. That means Canada has every incentive to diversify trade, reduce dependence, and harden its negotiating position now, while it still holds leverage. Financial markets understand this. Several analysts have begun modeling scenarios in which the July talks fail or drag on without resolution. In those scenarios, investment across North America slows sharply. Cross-border projects are delayed. Companies build more inventory buffers. Costs rise. Growth slows. None of this requires a formal trade war. It emerges naturally from uncertainty. The aluminum market is a perfect example. Prices are not high only because supply is tight. They are high because buyers are afraid it will get worse. The Midwest premium is reflecting not just current shortages, but fear of future disruption. That psychology is spreading into other materials and equipment markets. Politically, the pressure is building inside the United States. Business-aligned Republicans are increasingly uneasy. They are hearing from donors and constituents that the tariff strategy is hurting, not helping. Democrats are pushing for hearings and investigations, framing the crisis as evidence of policy failure and economic mismanagement. The administration is caught between its public posture and private reality. In Canada, the political incentives point the other way. Carney's tough stance is popular. It reinforces a narrative of sovereignty and economic independence. Even opposition parties are reluctant to appear weak in the face of American pressure. That means Ottawa has room to hold its line, at least for now. The most dangerous part of this phase is that it creates momentum. Once lawyers, insurers, and financial markets start treating a relationship as unstable, it becomes unstable. Companies change behavior. They delay decisions. They seek alternatives. They stop assuming that the old rules apply. This is how fragmentation happens, not through one dramatic break, but through hundreds of quiet adjustments. And yet there is still a deeper layer to this story, because beneath the legal fights and market reactions lies a more fundamental question. What happens to an economic system built on integration when its largest player starts treating interdependence as a weakness rather than a strength? In the final part, we will look at the long-term strategic consequences. The potential realignment of North American trade, the shift toward Europe and Asia, and why a single word may end up reshaping the economic map of the continent for years to come. By early 2026, it became clear that this conflict was no longer about a single demand, a single refusal, or even a single trade dispute. It was about the future structure of North American economic power. The machinery standoff did not create this shift. It revealed it. And once revealed, it could not be put back into the box. For decades, the United States built its economic strength on integration. Supply chains stretched across borders. Canada provided raw materials, energy, and industrial inputs. The US provided scale, capital, and markets. Efficiency came from trust. Predictability came from rules that were assumed to hold even during political turbulence. That assumption is now breaking down. The heavy machinery refusal marked a psychological turning point. It signaled that Canada no longer views unconditional accommodation as the cost of access to the US market. Instead, Ottawa is treating interdependence as leverage that must be protected, not surrendered. That mindset shift is already reshaping behavior. Canadian trade policy is pivoting in real time. Negotiations with the European Union are accelerating. Energy and industrial cooperation talks with Asian partners are expanding. The January 2026 visit to Beijing was not symbolic, it was transactional. Canada is building redundancy into its export strategy, ensuring that no single partner can dictate terms through pressure. Once these alternative channels mature, the gravitational pull of the US market weakens permanently. This matters because leverage is not something you can turn on and off. It exists only when alternatives do not. By pushing tariffs, threats, and urgent demands without corresponding capacity, Washington has unintentionally encouraged its closest partners to reduce dependence. That process is slow, but it is relentless, and it rarely reverses. For the United States, the cost of this shift will not appear as a single collapse. It will show up as friction, projects that take longer, inputs that cost more, investors that demand higher returns to compensate for political risk, allies that negotiate harder and concede less. This is how power erodes in modern systems, not through defeat, but through inefficiency. The USMCA review in July 2026 now stands as a critical inflection point. If it ends in escalation or stalemate, the message to global markets will be unmistakable. North America is no longer a predictable production zone. Capital will adapt accordingly. Supply chains will fragment further. Strategic industries will hedge by building outside the region rather than inside it. Ironically, the very policies designed to strengthen American leverage risk achieving the opposite. Tariffs do not create capacity. They create incentives. And the incentive being created right now is diversification away from the United States as a single anchor market. Canada understands this. Europe understands this. Asia understands this. Even Mexico is quietly recalculating, recognizing that a fragmented North America creates bargaining space it did not previously have. The continent is entering a phase where alignment is no longer automatic. From a strategic standpoint, this moment exposes a deeper truth about power in the 21st century. Power does not come from demands. It comes from systems that others choose to rely on. Once those systems are politicized, trust evaporates. Once trust evaporates, leverage fades. Trump's tariffs were meant to force compliance. Instead, they exposed dependence. And when that dependence became visible, Canada responded not with confrontation, but with refusal. A calm, structural no. That refusal worked because it was backed by reality, by capacity constraints, by market alternatives, by timing. The market saw it, the lawyers saw it, the insurers saw it, and now governments are adjusting. For American workers, the consequences will be uneven but real. Some industries will face higher costs. Some projects will slow or be canceled. Some jobs will disappear not because demand is gone, but because access is unstable. That is a harder problem to fix than a recession. For policymakers, the lesson is uncomfortable. Economic coercion is only effective when the coercing party controls excess capacity. In this case, it does not. The attempt to force priority access revealed the opposite. Scarcity sits elsewhere. This is why the one word mattered so much. Not because it was defiant, but because it was accurate. The realignment is already underway. It is quiet. It is technical. And it is structural. By the time it becomes obvious to the public, it will be irreversible. This was never just about machinery. It was about whether North America would continue as an integrated economic system or fragment into competing blocs shaped by political risk. The answer is now being written, not in speeches, but in contracts, shipping routes, and investment decisions. And once those move, power follows. That is the real story behind the refusal.